Hey gang, it is so great to be together today, and I got this one question. I think this thing that we all have in common. Aren't you ready to get back to normal? Now, I know that for some of us, this has been a welcome break. We just needed to take a pause moment. For others of us, this last season has been a really difficult season. But I think the thing that we all have in common is right now, we want to get back to normal. But in light of what we've experienced together and in light of what we've learned, wouldn't it be a waste if we just went back to the normal? And so a lot of people are talking about a new normal, right? Maybe you've had that discussion with your family and with somebody, a new normal. And I want to challenge us today as we go into a new normal. If we're wise, we would do well to pause and to ask ourselves questions. A question. The question being, what is it that we've learned in this season, and what do we want to carry with us into the future? Now, look, I've learned a lot of things. One of the things I've learned is that the producers of Mad Max, they had it all wrong. Remember in 2015, Mad Max Fury Road came out? They said that in an apocalypse, the most valuable commodity was oil. It was actually oil. But we've learned that it wasn't actually oil, it's actually, that's right, toilet paper. Toilet paper is the most valuable commodity, I guess, in an apocalypse. But today I want to ask some questions. I want to ask this question: how can we take what we've learned with us and carry it into the next season, into the future? And this is the big question I want you to think about. How can you be stronger for what you've experienced? A lot of what we're going through right now, it was forced on us. But how can we come out of this pandemic situation and be stronger for what we've learned and what we've experienced? How can we do that? I want to go back and just recap a little bit of last week's message. In fact, if you didn't get to hear it, I would encourage you to go and listen to it. It will help in this week. But we talked about how after 400 years of bondage and slavery in Egypt, God used a man named Moses to lead his people out of that bondage and slavery through the Red Sea onto the way to the Promised Land. And instead of taking them in a direct route, which would have been like an 11-day journey, God takes them on a southern route into the desert of Sinai, and it actually takes them about 2 years to get to the place where they're just right on the edge of going into the Promised Land. Because they don't go in, God actually takes them for another 38 years in the desert for a time of testing and a time of teaching. That tells us that it takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort for God to test and for God to teach us. And so He takes them on this time of testing and teaching so that they can learn some things, so that they can gain perspective that they will take with them and they'll carry into the Promised Land and into their future. Now, why is this so important? Why is this time of humility and refining and teaching so important? Pastor Jim LaFoon, one of our Every Nation pastors, I think he sums it up best. He says this: it's only when we have humility that God can bless us without destroying us in the blessing. It's only when we have that humility. So there is a pain that we're going through that is producing a humility. It is causing our lives to become refined, and it is teaching us something. But wouldn't it be a huge waste if we lost the perspective we're gaining and if we just left the teaching and the lessons that we're learning right now? It would just be a lot of pain. So after 40 years of testing and teaching, the generation that disobeyed and that grumbled and complained in the wilderness, they're all dead. And Moses is now addressing their children as they prepare to finally cross the Jordan and follow Joshua into the Promised Land. And in Deuteronomy, this is what Moses warns them to do. He says this: be careful. Be careful. In other words, pay attention. Be careful to follow every command that I'm giving you today, so that you may live and increase in the land, and you may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. So Moses warns them to obey or to do the things that they've learned and to take with them the perspective that they've learned in the desert in this time of testing and teaching, so that they can actually enter into the land, they can actually live there and flourish, and they can stay there without being destroyed because they drifted from God or went back to their old ways. So he says, be careful. And then he says this, verse 2, remember how the Lord your God He led you all the way in the wilderness, these 40 years, to do this, to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. So Moses tells, remember the lessons that you learned. Remember how the Lord humbled you in the wilderness so that you would have a greater reliance on Him. Remember how He tested your hearts and revealed to you what was in there so that He could refine you. And remember how He taught you. He taught you, and you learned in the wilderness that more than bread for your stomach, you needed the presence of God and you needed His Word for your soul. Remember how He humbled you, how He refined you and revealed in your heart, and remember how He taught you those things. And so carry those things with you into the future. And in verse 7 He says, for the Lord your God, He's bringing you into a good land. Now there's going to be a problem with this. He's going to bless you. So be careful. Again, pay attention and do not forget the lessons that the Lord your God taught you. If you fail to observe His commandments and His laws and decrees that I'm giving you today. And so He says this, don't forget what you learned. Don't forget the perspective that you gained. Otherwise, your painful journey will be a waste. It'll just be pain. But take those lessons, take that perspective with you into the future. And in verse 12, He says this, otherwise, if you forget when you eat and are satisfied, when you experience the blessing and the goodness of God, when there's no more pressure on your life, when you build your fine houses and you settle down, when your herds and your flocks, they grow large, and your silver and your gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart may become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God. He's the one who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So when the pain of the desert has begun to subside and your desperation for the Lord is not so great, do not forget, or your heart will become proud and it will revert back to your old way of thinking, and your desperation will not be as great. And you'll begin to think that you could handle it on your own, and it was on your own doing that you were able to make it. He says in verse 17, you may even say to yourself, my power and my strength and the strength of my hands have produced all of this wealth. And that word wealth, it doesn't just mean financial wealth. It actually means just the wealth of life. It means the flourishing. It means the blessing of not just finances, but the blessing of life. But you might say that my power, my hands have produced all this wealth. But remember, don't forget, it's the Lord your God. It is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth. So He tells them, you guys got to be careful so that you don't forget the lessons that you learned and the perspective that you gained. You learned that God was faithful. You learned that He was your healer, and that He was your provider, and that He was your source, and that He was your sustainer, and that He was the source of the power that you needed to be successful. And if you forget all of that when you go into your future, all that it will be is just pain in the desert. So don't forget, remember. And if we don't stop to ask this question, how can I be stronger for it? We will forget as well. And look, that would be a huge waste, because pain without gain, it is just pain, more pain. Now I know some of you right now are feeling like you're not in the place to be able to ask this question because you're still in the middle of it, or you're still feeling the pain of it. And let me just push back on that a little bit and invite you still to ask this question. Because what I don't know is how difficult this has been for you or continues to be for you. I know for some of you, you're going through a lot of difficulty right now. But what I do know for all of us is that if we don't pay attention, we won't benefit from it. And our tendency is to rush right back into the old normal and to miss the lessons that we could have learned in this season as we go into a new season, and that would benefit us in the new season. I love the way that C.S. Lewis explains this or describes this tendency that we have in his book called The Problem of Pain. I'm going to read it together. He says this, my own experience is something like this. I'm progressing along the path of life in my ordinary, contentedly fallen and godless condition. I'm absorbed in my merry meetings with friends for the morrow, or a bit of work that tickles my vanity today, a holiday or a new book. And then he says, when suddenly there's a stab of abdominal pain that threatens serious disease, or a headline in the newspapers that threatens all of us with destruction. And that threat sends the whole pack of cards tumbling down. At first, I'm overwhelmed, and my little happiness looks like broken toys. Then slowly, reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I should have always been in, or that I should be in at all times. I remind myself that these toys, they were never intended to possess my heart, that my true good is in another world, and that my only real treasure is Christ. And perhaps by the grace of God, I succeed, and for a day or two, I become a creature who's consciously dependent on God, drawing its strength from the right resources. But the moment the threat is withdrawn, we all know what comes next because it's all of our stories, right? Maybe this was your story. Maybe a few years ago, your husband or your wife, they came to you and said, look, if you don't change, I'm out of here. I mean, we've gone through counseling, we talked about this, and I'm not seeing any permanent change. And all of a sudden, he or she had your attention. He or she had you in the place that you needed to be, and you began making some changes, and you began coming home earlier from work, and you began listening better, and you began spending time and paying attention to the children, and you became a different person, and your marriage grew stronger for it. But that was just a moment, and then the moment ended and the threat was withdrawn, and then you began to retreat to your old ways. It only lasted for a while. Or maybe this is your story. You're a single person and you know that you need to stop partying as much as you are and stop drinking as much as you are. And then you got to that accident, and thank God you didn't get hurt, but you're afraid that you're going to be sued. And so you go back to what you used to do and you begin to seek God. Or maybe for the first time you begin to pray and you begin to call out to God and you begin to try and follow Him, and you begin to take great strides for a while. And then you find out you're not going to get sued. And for a while, you are a different person, and for a while you're going after God. But then the threat is withdrawn, and then you begin to drift back to your old normal. You begin to drift back to your old ways. Or maybe this is your story. Maybe this is your story. You go for your annual physical and the doctor tells you, like he or she has told you many times before, look, we've talked about this, and if you don't change your lifestyle, you will not be around to play with your grandchildren. And suddenly, he or she has your attention. You begin to make those changes. You begin to eat differently, you begin to exercise, you even begin to feel better. And people around you tell you, man, it looks like you got more energy. And you begin to make those changes for a while. Only for a while you stick with it, but then the moment the threat is withdrawn and you start drifting back to your old ways, to your old normal. I mean, what's wrong with us? I think all of us, we have this tendency to have to be brought to the brink of disaster before we're willing to make the changes that we really know all along we should be making. What is that about us? C.S. Lewis goes on, but the moment the threat is withdrawn, my whole nature leaps back to the toys. God has had me for but 48 hours, and then only by the dint or by the force or by the blow of taking everything else away from me. Let Him sheathe that sword. Let Him put away that sword for a moment. Let Him ease that pain. You know what that tells me? That tells me that in order for us to gain through this pain, we have to be intentional. Because if we're not intentional, we'll all drift back to the old normal and we'll not learn the things that we're supposed to learn, that we're supposed to take into the next season. He says this, but let Him sheathe or put away that sword for a moment, and I behave like a puppy when the hated bath is over. I shake myself as dry as I can, and then I race off to reacquire my comfortable dirtiness, if not in the nearest manure heap, or at least in the nearest flower bed. Right? That's just what we do. It seems to be human nature to return to the bad habits once the pain associated with those habits is no longer there. It's gone. When it's gone, we seem to drift back. So let me ask you this question one more time. How can we grow through this trial? How can we not just go through, but how can we grow through this trial? The answer is we have to ask this question. How can we be stronger for it? You don't want to forget. You don't want to forget this time of humbling. You don't want to forget this time of refining. You don't want to forget this time of teaching where we've learned in a greater way to trust in God and in His presence. But we will if we don't ask this question in this moment, how can we be stronger for it? Or let me frame it differently. Let me ask you this question. How should you, or what should you begin doing that you should have been doing all along. For some of us, this moment is just revealing things that we really knew that we should have been doing and taking care of all along. And I'm going to look at 3 specific areas today, and I want to ask this more specifically. How can you be stronger for it financially? How can you be stronger for it financially? What have you been doing financially that has really been undoing you? Or what have you been doing financially that has now caught up with you in this season? Or let me ask it like this. What do you wish you had already been doing financially? What do you wish you had already been doing financially? Whatever comes to mind, that's probably the answer, and you should begin doing that right now. You should begin doing that right now. Here's the beautiful thing about this moment is that the pressure of this moment is giving us an opportunity to see a little bit more clearly as we ask this question, how can we be stronger for it? Or how can we be stronger for it financially? The pressure of this moment is digging down, and it's revealing to us these 2 big financial realities. Number 1, it's better to go without the things that you don't need than to owe money for the things that you don't need. Wanting something is way better than owing for something. And here's the second big one, and this comes more directly to us. If you're experiencing a hole financially right now, it's at least due in part to a lack of self-control. A hole in our lives financially is at least due in part to our lack of self-control. You may be feeling the pain of it in a big way, and I know there are a lot of other circumstances, and I want to encourage you not to blame the circumstances. I know there's the virus, and there's the economy, and there's your boss, but the only way that we grow from this is to be able to take responsibility for our part and what we can do. And now is the time when we're feeling this pressure, because most often a hole in our lives financially is due to a lack of self-control in our lives financially. And the scripture in Proverbs, in fact, if you've never read the book of Proverbs, it is a great book of wisdom. And in the book of Proverbs, there is a description that is given of somebody who lacks self-control. And this is what it says. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Now that picture doesn't make maybe a lot of sense to us, but in the ancient world it certainly did, because the city walls were the things that gave the city and the wall and the people inside the city protection, security, safety, and a sense of control, keeping the bad guys out. But what the enemy would do was they would find a portion of the wall that was weak, and they would concentrate all their forces on that portion to breach or to break through that wall so that they could enter in and take control of the city. So what the scripture is saying is that when the walls are broken through, the people within the city, they lose their security, they lose their peace, and they lose their sense of control. The enemy now has the control of their lives, so they lose their ability to control their lives. In the same way, a person who lacks self-control will eventually, ultimately, lose control over their own life. Not only in the area of finances, but in all areas. So here's the point. A lack of self-control, and this applies to any area of life, will ultimately lead to a loss of control. So a key to having control is exercising self-control. So let me ask you this question one more time. How can you be stronger for it? We can all be stronger for it by exercising self-control. Something that we like to say here, just 3 real quick things. Number 1, save more, spend less, get out, and stay out of debt. That's how we can all exercise self-control. Spend less, save more, get out, and stay out of debt. And I know some of you are going, this is painful right now, but now is the time for you to make the adjustment. Now is the time for you to take notes. Now is the time for you to make a plan. Now is the time for you to determine to exercise self-control so that you can be stronger for it. So you can be stronger for it. Second question that I think is really helpful to ask in this season would be, how can we be stronger for it relationally? What is it you've experienced in the past few months that you want to carry forward with you into the future relationally? I think one thing that we've all experienced is just the value of friendships and maybe the value of certain friends in your life. Some of you who are involved in a small group, you know the value of the people in your small groups. But I think another thing that we've experienced, if we'll pay attention, is that there are some relational pains and cracks that are being revealed. For some of us, maybe you've seen some relational cracks in your marriage during this time. and you've kind of known they've been there, and at times they'll come to the surface, but you've been busy, or they just haven't been front and center, they haven't been that great of a threat, and you've been able just to kind of ignore them and move on. But right now in this season when we're all together at stay at home, it's right there in front of you, and you have the opportunity to see this thing. Or maybe some of you have just noticed a lack of connection with somebody in your family. Maybe it's your whole family, or it's a certain child that you just don't feel a connection with. And again, since we're all together right now, maybe before you've just been too busy, but right now it's just front and center. That's one of the beauties of this time of quarantining. It is highlighting the good, but it's also bringing attention to the not so good. But our opportunity in this whole thing is something that I don't want you to miss. COVID-19 could actually be the thing that calls us to wake up relationally. And that is this wake-up call, and it will work if we do this, if we wake up and if we pay attention to it. I mean, your story, because ultimately this thing is going to just be a story for all of us. Your story could be that this was a time when God used COVID-19 as a catalyst to save your marriage. If you will right now take the time to pay attention and to address the cracks in your relationship. Your story could be that this is the time that God used COVID-19 to help me relationally repair a relationship with somebody that I felt disconnected with in my family. Instead of placing blame, instead of just ignoring the moment, we have the opportunity to pay attention and to write a new story into the future. But in order to do that, we have to withstand the temptation just to rush back into the old normal. And look, the truth is, relationally, if you have situations or cracks or things that are happening there and you ignore them hoping they'll get better, they won't get better, they'll just get worse. So this is our opportunity right now where we're facing this pressure that is forcing us to face some of the things that maybe we've neglected or maybe we've overlooked in our relationship. This is our opportunity to write a brand new story as we allow this to grab our attention and we ask this question: how can we be stronger for it relationally? There's a third thing that I want to talk about. Before I get there, I want to invite my friend Eric to come and just share a little bit about how God is using the pressure of this moment to do a work in his life. Here's Eric. Hey Eric, great to see you today, man. Great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is a real treat because we have somebody who's from the medical community and also somebody who's from the military to give us a unique perspective during this season. So thanks a lot for being with us. I want to invite you to introduce yourself, but also give a little thought to this question. You know, what have you learned or what perspective have you gained through what we've experienced?
Yeah, so as you said, my name is Eric Wertz, and then I've had the pleasure, I've been in the military now for 13 years. I try not to brag too much, but I've been in Hawaii for 11 of those 13 years. So I've really been blessed from that fact. But the reason why is I'm an ear, nose, and throat doctor up at Tripler, and so that gives me a little bit more stability than most Army people have. But life's been interesting. You know, we've got a wife, Rachel, who sang last week at church, and then I got 3 kids from 4 to 2 to 2 months. So
wow,
life is busy. But to answer your question, you know, kind of what I've learned from this whole COVID thing, I think is it makes people realize their own mortality, and people don't like to realize they're mortal. You know, I mean, I think obviously that's where we have the advantage in Christ is, you know, as Paul said, to live as Christ and to die as gain. It's a win-win situation, you know. And
what adjustments do you think you'll make because you know those things now that will help you just be stronger going forward?
As I was going through this, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, a message you preached, I think probably a year or so ago, about there's only a couple jobs that that I'm the only one who can do, right? And one of those is my relationship with God, and the second that is to be a husband to my wife and a father to my children. And I think that this has really made me realize in everything that I'm doing, you know, I'm thinking, is this something that I need to be doing now, or is there other higher priorities, you know, time with God or time with my family that I should be doing?
Eric, if you were to sit across the table from somebody and maybe share a little bit of your life and what you've been learning, what would you encourage them to do so that they don't forget, but they remember the lesson that they've learned and they take it with them into the future, so they don't just live the same way they did before all this happened, but they actually grew and lived a different way? What would you say?
It's easy to say and hard to do, but I think the answer is really just to press into God, right? I mean, because as the Bible says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, right? And if you're doing that, then that's the answer to all the questions, right? And if you're doing that on a daily basis and praying and spending your time in the Word and worshiping, and by default, everything else is going to fall in line. Your priorities are going to fall in line. Your interests, your passions, all that stuff is going to fall right in line. And along with that, right? I mean, through all this COVID, all we have is trust in God, right? I mean, we really don't know what our future is going to hold, right? I mean, things are looking good now, but this has really made us realize that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. There could be another surge and we'll be right back where we started, and all you can really do is put your faith in God and leave it to Him, because it doesn't help. It doesn't help to worry. It doesn't help to be anxious, because all you can do is pray and leave it up to God.
That's so good. That's so good. And you've kind of lived through that. I mean, your last baby, your son, just came. Literally, we can track the whole pandemic by his birthday, almost, here in Hawaii anyway.
You're completely right. And there was, some worries, along with that. And then also, as the stuff was starting up and, we got a little bit of a sneak peek of what was happening in New York and in Washington, and, another fear, and made us really have a come to Jesus moment, so to speak, with Rachel and I. We started having the talk of, if things heat up, am I going to come home? Because with being at the hospital, then you realize that you're definitely exposing yourself. And is it, should you come home, or should you just not come home for an extended period of time? And that's a lot of, psychological burden on me, but then not only a psychological burden, but also a childcare and everything else, life burden on Rachel. And so that was really a time that we had to trust God, and really just, we could have sat there worrying about things, and there's the natural, you're going to worry about some, but a lot of it's just praying and saying, God, we know that you've got the best plan for us, and we don't know what tomorrow holds, but whatever you have, we're here for, we're ready.
Eric, is there maybe one or two things, or maybe one thing that you are thinking, I wish I would have done that before this moment, but now I'm going to make sure that I do it going forward?
I think that one thing that I would have done differently is, it took me a little while to transition into this different schedule, and with that, unfortunately, you hate to say it, but my quiet time was the thing that went away for a while, just because I'm a creature of habit. I've got a routine, and when I've got it planned in, it works. But then when the schedule changes, that's usually that has been the first thing to go, which is not good, right? And so I think, for me, one thing that I've learned is I need to find a way, like tithing, right? The way that I remember tithe is, as soon as that money comes in, that's the first thing to go out, right? You don't wait till the end, because otherwise there may not be an end. So,
right.
I've learned that with my quiet time. I need to find a way to incorporate that to the beginning of the day, the start of the day, because otherwise, if you let it wait, it just won't happen. And also, with changes in schedule, just get into routine. That's the first thing you do when you wake up.
Eric, thanks, man.
Yeah, Pastor Greg. Happy to help.
Appreciate it. And you have fun seeing yourself this Sunday in service.
Thanks, Pastor Greg.
I love that. That was so helpful. What Eric is learning and the perspective he's gaining and how he's going to take it into the future, so helpful. So let me ask you this final question. How can you be stronger for this personally? How can you grow stronger through this personally? Right now, how is your faith and your worldview holding up? You know, worldview, it's that thing that we see and interpret and explain the world and the way the world works. How is it holding up in this time? Sometimes when difficult times come into our lives, our faith and our worldview, they get rocked, right? If your faith and your worldview right now are rocked, here's what I encourage you to do. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to that. Do you find yourself asking questions that you've never asked before? In particular, if you're not particularly religious, are you maybe beginning to pray or try to pray or maybe read the Bible? Pay attention to that. That's a good sign. That's a sign that there is something that you're reaching out for. If you are a Christian and you found that maybe you have these questions of your faith, you know, God, why is this happening? And I don't understand it. And Lord, where are you in this season? In either case, this is our opportunity to pay attention to the tension that we're feeling on the inside. Not just to ignore it. It means that you and I are on the verge of learning something. It means that we're on the verge of being reminded maybe of something that we've forgotten or we just never knew. I love what the psalmist says in Psalm 119. It says this, before I was afflicted, and that word afflicted means before I was humbled or brought low. Before that, I just went astray. But now I've learned to obey your word. It was good for me to be brought low so that I might learn your decrees. So he's basically saying, before I felt the pain of this moment and was brought low and humbled, I just kind of lived my life the way that I wanted to live my life. I just did what I wanted to do. I knew you were there and I called on you when I needed you, but in general, I just kind of lived my life the way that I wanted to live my life and kind of felt like I could handle it on my own. And so the psalmist is saying that I just kind of lived and forgot how desperately I needed you, God, how desperately I needed your presence and how desperately I needed your word. And it was this crisis moment that revealed or reminded me of how desperately I needed to depend on the presence of God. A.W. Tozer, who is a Christian, lived a few decades ago, once said, if the Holy Spirit was withdrawn from the church today, 95% of what we do would go on and no one would even know the difference. I mean, that sounds like a shocking thing to say, but you know what? I think in many cases it's true. In the normal mode of life, we just kind of go on and we're able to live without God or around God. And it's these moments of crisis that bring us back to this reality, one that's easy to forget, that you and I were created to have a relationship with our Heavenly Father. In fact, life doesn't make sense without Him. And when we forget that, our priorities and our affections, they get all out of whack. By this time, maybe this time you're feeling a little bit of pressure now, and that pressure is creating tension on the inside of you, and you're realizing that the things that you normally go to for comfort or hope or peace or just for direction in life, they're not sufficient. And maybe and hopefully, as you're paying attention, you're being reminded of how desperately you need the presence of God. We were created to live with it. We weren't created to exist apart from it. We need the presence of God to bring new life into our dead, sin-filled human spirits. We need the presence of God to cleanse us from the death mark that sin has left on our lives. We need the presence of God to renew and to regenerate and to heal and to cause our lives to overflow with the hope that only comes from the power of the Holy Spirit. We need the presence of God to experience peace with Him. We need the presence of God to be filled with a joy that we can't even express with words. We need the presence of God to realign our hearts with His purpose, to partner with Him, to fill the earth with His presence and the good news of Jesus Christ. And we need the presence of God to have the power of God spilling out of our lives as we go into all the world and take the life-transforming news of Jesus Christ and what He did when He died on that cross and rose from the dead to break the power of sin, death, and hell. We need the power of God. And if we're paying attention right now, I think we have the opportunity to make some changes. Make some changes that we take with us into the future and not go back to our old ways. So I'd encourage you, as you ask this question, how can I be stronger for it personally? Pay attention. Pay attention to the things that's happening in your heart. Create or develop a new rhythm of relationship and dependence on God. and then make sure that you decide not to go back. But you carry that with you into the future. You carry a new desperation for God and for His presence and for His Word with you into the future. And you will be stronger for it personally. You'll be stronger for it personally. So as we come to this moment where we're trying to figure out how we can remember this, let me encourage you once again to decide. You have to make a decision to be stronger for it. Let's not, as C.S. Lewis said, behave like that puppy when the hated bath is over and just run back to our old normal and run back to the manure pile or to the dirt. Let's not forget the lessons that we have learned. Let's not lose the perspective that we've gained. But here's the truth about all of us. It is so easy for us to forget. It's so easy because we're so prone just to move on. And I want to encourage you to pay attention and to think about what you want to carry forward into this next season of your life. And I want to encourage you to do this by creating a reminder. Something that will be a visual reminder of what you want to remember. Attach a memory to that thing. Something that will remind you of this season and what you want to carry forward in your life. Now, for me, the reminder has been just getting these 3x5 cards. And I get these 3x5 cards and I write scriptures on them and I memorize the scriptures, the things that God has taught me, the things that I've learned, and the things that I want to remember so that I can carry them forward into the future. That's the way that I do it. But something that you can put in a prominent place, that when you see it, you'll be reminded of something that God has taught you and what you want to remember so that you can carry it with you into this next season. And maybe for some of you, it's just a reminder that you need to slow down. Maybe for others of you, it's a reminder that you need to create a plan and exercise self-control when it comes to your money and to your finances. Or for others of us, it's going to be a reminder of the value of our friendships, and maybe you just even feel like calling somebody that you haven't talked to in a while, but you've been thinking about that, and it will remind you of that. I think for others of us, it could be a reminder that we need to dig in and we need to deal with the cracks in our marriage and in our relationships. Or for others of us, it's the reminder that we need to invest in a relationship where we haven't felt connection with somebody, and instead of just ignoring it and putting it off, we're going to invest in that relationship. Or maybe for many of us, I think, it's a reminder of who and what is most important in our lives. Something that we'll remember that. Or for others of us, it's a reminder of the reality that in this season we have learned that we actually have more in common with each other than not. Or maybe for you, it is just this big reminder, probably the biggest one of all, the one that Eric talked about. It's this reminder of our desperation and dependence on God's presence in our life. His Word and our commitment to seek Him more, to live more in a daily presence and relationship with the God that loves us. Because here's my hope. My hope is that we will come back out of COVID-19 stronger than we went into it. And we will come back stronger and write a better story with our life, because eventually this will pass, this will all be over, and COVID-19, it will be a story. And our lives have the opportunity to tell a better story as we go into a new normal. So let me remind you of these two questions. Number one, how can you be stronger for it? How can you be stronger for it? And number two, what will help you remember that? What can you create to attach a memory to it that will help you remember it so that you can take that into the new normal? Like you, I am really looking forward to being back together again and out of this moment. But I don't want you to miss the moment that we have and the opportunity that we have in this moment. I'd say in this unique, hopefully once in a lifetime moment, we have the opportunity to learn something and to gain a perspective that will serve us well in the future. We've been saying from the very beginning, we don't want to just go through this trial, but I believe that God wants us to grow through this trial so that we come back stronger for having experienced what we've experienced. But in order for that to happen, we have to pause. We have to stop long enough to say, how can we be stronger for it? And how or what will I do to remember it? Thank you for joining our Grace Honolulu YouTube channel. If you haven't yet subscribed, please subscribe to it so that you can keep track with all the sermons that are coming out. As well, you can follow us on social media and download our Grace Honolulu app to stay connected. As well, if you'd like to give, you can always give at our website, gracehonolulu.org. Thanks for watching, Have a great week. God bless you.